Wow, we are now aware of the reason that SWEN, the man at Larian Studios who produced Baldur's Gate 3 and Divinity Original Sin 2, games that nobody cares about. We now have an inkling as to why this guy was pushed to the forefront. Much like Neil Druckmann and Sean Murray before him, this guy is a complete and total fraud that the game industry is hoping will be taken seriously when it comes to hot gaming takes, right? What hot new exclusives have come out this generation, guys? I can't think of a single one. Right? Swen released a statement saying that like, oh, we at Larian Studios don't have a generation defining game, right? We don't look at the competition and tell ourselves that, oh, this is the best game released this generation, right? It was true for past generations, but not this one. And of course, a bunch of like Larian cocksuckers just came on and said, "Oh, Swin, you made the console generation defining game." Never mind that Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't a console exclusive, right? Which was exactly his point. But like again, it was dumb to begin with. But looking at this, the obvious is very clear here, and this has been something I've been noticing for a while. Like all of these people love to pretend that Nintendo doesn't exist, because if you're a Nintendo fan, you've been like hit with generation-defining games like all gen, right? The Legend of Zelda, Mario Odyssey, Animal Crossing: New Horizons, Splatoon 2 and 3. Uh, the list goes on and on and on, really, right? Like it's crazy how even like middle tier or even lower tier games like Pikmin 4, like how many Nintendo games are just stopping Baldur's Gate 3, Starfield, Hogwarts Legacy. Like again, there are a lot of games that I would consider like generation defining on the Switch. But it seems like the gaming industry, the community as a whole, doesn't acknowledge it. In fact, there's this very real dispute that the Switch isn't even really a next gen platform, right? Like, oh, the Switch was last generation, right? That's kind of the cope, right? Like, it's just an excuse to avoid talking about Nintendo wherever possible, right? And I think over the past couple of days, seeing how Nintendo has like been dominating this financial quarter, how they're not going third party like Xbox and Microsoft are, how like they're continually putting out new games, like how everybody's like bending over backwards to avoid talking about them. Like you really do get the impression that the lack of respect for Nintendo is a straight up epidemic, right? Like it is straight up delusional how far people go in avoiding talking about the company, avoiding in taking them seriously, right? Because even if the Switch was a last generation console, it's not. Like, it's still being supported today. So, like, it's still extremely popular today. Like, it's still leading the market today. So at the very least, you should like at least be talking about its upcoming games. But no, instead you just see the same people bend over backwards, making up nonsense about the games, right? Angry Joe releasing statements like, "Oh, we can't do reviews on them because Nintendo will copyright strike our videos." Never mind that people like myself stream and review the games with no problems, right? Never mind all the legions of other Nintendo YouTubers who are doing it. Never mind that like these are the biggest releases of the year. No, we're just gonna ignore them. We're gonna pretend that Baldur's Gate 3 is more relevant. We're gonna pretend that Hogwarts Legacy is more relevant. Like we're gonna ignore like the actual quality of the games and focus instead on like, oh man, it's D&D, it's Harry Potter. It's completely ridiculous. And I would argue it's been that way for a long time, since at least the 90s, right? Like I think this goes back to the I think this has roots back in like the Sega Genesis era, where people would like say Sonic the Hedgehog was better than Super Mario World because, oh, look at how fast he goes. Never mind the lack of content and just the pacing problems and what the franchise eventually turned into, right? Like there was a very real push to pretend that Sonic was better than Mario, right? Just like there was a push to pretend Crash was better than Mario and Spyro was better than Mario and Jack and Daxter was better than Mario and then Ratchet and Clank was better than Mario. Like
every couple of years they have to prop up like something new because like the old thing keeps getting immediately blown out, like destroyed and completely forgotten, you know. And like the excuse people have is that like, oh, Mario just has stronger brand recognition. But why does it have stronger recognition? It's because the games are better. You know, like a lot of Mario fans grew up playing Spyro, playing Jack and Daxter, playing Crash, you know, like playing all these other games, you know, and I liked some of them, right? You know, I'm a big fan of Spyro 3. But those games did not stay relevant the way Mario did. They did not evolve like Mario did. They did not tackle new concepts and ideas like Mario did, right? The reality is, Mario was simply better than these other franchises, but like the industry just refused to admit it, right? Like we're in this weird period now where Nintendo put out like one of the best 2D platformers of all time, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and much like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze before it, like the game journalists are just throwing up their hands and trying to say that it's just another Mario game, guys. It's just a fluke, right? The sales are only because of the movie. You know, instead of like acknowledging, oh wow, Mario Wonder is another game I would consider generation defining. Wow, but like, um, they're throwing up their hands. Like, remember when that game was first shown off, and everybody tried to say that, like, yeah, it's not gonna do well. It's the last major game on Switch. Like, you know, it's not that interesting. You know, this isn't a major release on Switch. You know, Maximilian Dude said that. You know, I there was such a big push to downplay that game, and then it actually came out, and it was like a phenomenon, right? And now you're having people in my comment section trying to gaslight you into saying that, like, oh, that never happened. Nobody ever said that. But no, they did, right? They did. And now I think, now that we're like halfway through the PS5 generation, like we have people like SWEN coming out trying to say that, like, oh, there have been no good games this generation, indicating that, like, oh, there have been no good Nintendo games this generation, which of course is objectively not true and really should be an argument that's like mocked and derided, right? Like, I don't see anybody else like calling out SWEN on his bullshit, right? Like this is the first moment that like I've really started to test him as a person, right? Like I've always spoken out about Baldur's Gate 3 and how it wasn't that great, but I've always felt like okay, let's go after the community. Like I don't have anything against the developers. I don't have a reason to dislike them. You know, I don't want to like make fun of Larian like before I understand what they're all about. But like seeing this blatant attempt at like downplaying all of the great games this generation, like, oh, nobody's talking about them. Yeah, because everybody has terrible taste and refuses to acknowledge like what's actually out there, right? And we're seeing this all the time. And I'm calling this out. I'm doing everything I can to address this situation. You know, this is why the channel exists to address these kind of corrupt individuals trying to warp our perspectives on what's popular and what isn't, right? Because the reality is, yes, no, Baldur's Gate 3 was not that popular, right? It was not a generation defining game. It was not some masterful CRPG with masterful storytelling that like redefined the genre. No, it was a basic game that got attention because nothing else came out that year, right? The reality is the gaming journalism industry had to put forward something to push the woke agenda, and they only had Baldur's Gate 3. Right, Final Fantasy 16 wasn't going to cut it. Forspoken wasn't going to cut it. Like they had to use a new IP to force it in the limelight and try and gaslight people into thinking that like Mario wasn't spectacular, Zelda wasn't spectacular, Fire Emblem wasn't spectacular, right? Pokemon wasn't spectacular. Like they had to do everything they could to downplay all these generation-defining Nintendo games by putting forward a mid RPG that people aren't going to remember this year, right? Like it has been interesting seeing like Larian's fall from relevancy, but again, I've made comparisons to Dragon Age Inquisition, and I do think we are kind of seeing the same patterns, like that we did with BioWare, with like the creators speaking out against other RPGs, you know, declaring them to not be real entries in the genre, and like lording over the rest of the industry as their company slowly rots from within. You know, like I do expect to see that with Larian. You know, now that like I do think that like the way they conducting themselves about this, the way the gaming media tried hyping them up, It is disgusting, right? Like this is no different than No Man's Sky. This is no different than Last of Us, right? Like no different than The Witcher 3. Like it is just a last ditch effort from the dying gaming media to prop up an irrelevant gaming industry, right? Like the Western video game industry has completely failed, right? They're in free fall right now. They're in collapse. Like nobody's putting out good games, especially not Larian. And the reality is, Nintendo is the only company in the world who is producing good generation defining games, right? The gaming media is in denial about it. You know, creators are in denial about it. But the reality is, Nintendo is completely stomping the rest of the industry.